Welcome to one of the darkest cases in the long and unsettling history of New Orleans. Before we begin, take a moment to share in the comments where you are listening from and the exact time you pressed play, because it's always fascinating to see when and where these stories travel. Deep in the archives of the Louisiana State Historical Society, there is a collection of papers that most people have never heard of. They were sealed away in 1963. After the last person to study them, a professor named Harold Whitman, suddenly walked away from his career and never returned to academia. What he uncovered in those brittle pages has sat untouched for decades. Maybe because it was better left that way. The tale begins in the spring of 1832, when New Orleans was booming like never before. The Louisiana Purchase was still fresh history, and the city had grown into a crossroads of cultures, French, Spanish American, and African. The port never slept, ships loaded with cotton and sugar sailing out, while goods from across the globe poured in. Fortunes were rising and collapsing every day, and the city was alive with ambition, rivalry, and opportunity. Into this whirlwind stepped Thomas Caldwell, a seasoned merchant from Boston, who at 47 decided to uproot his family and chase prosperity in the South. He had already made a name for himself in Massachusetts, but the wealth flowing through New Orleans was impossible to ignore. Letters preserved in city records show he spent nearly 3 years arranging the move, cultivating connections and securing trade contracts before bringing his wife Eleanor, their 3 children James, Catherine, and young William, along with 4 loyal servants. The Caldwells purchased a large property just beyond the French Quarter in what we now know as the Garden District. The house itself had a strange history. Built in the late 1700s by a French merchant who fled after a financial scandal, it passed through at least 4 different owners in the 3 decades before the Caldwells arrived. Oddly, tax assessments show the house always sold for far less than similar homes in the area, despite its size and desirable location. One note scribbled in the margin of an 1817 sale record mentions the buyer was warned of certain undesirable features, though no explanation was ever given. Eleanor Caldwell came from a well-connected Boston family with deep ties to the shipping industry, and together with Thomas, she seemed poised to cement the Caldwell name in New Orleans society. Their household included Martha, a servant from Virginia, who had been with the family nearly 20 years. Elijah, a free man of color who worked as coachman and handyman, Maria, local cook, and Isabel, a young housemaid. On the surface, everything looked like the beginning of a prosperous new chapter, but history would prove otherwise. Eleanor Caldwell's marriage to Thomas was shaped as much by business as by affection. Her father, Richard Harrington, had bankrolled Thomas's earliest ventures, and the union tied 2 merchant families together. According to Martha, the longtime servant Eleanor had fought bitterly against the move to New Orleans. She wept for days after the decision was final, insisting Boston was civilized, while New Orleans still felt half wild. Their eldest son, James, was preparing for Harvard when his father's ambitions redirected his path. His private journals, discovered after the tragedy of 1833, reveal the conflict of a young man resentful at losing his academic future, yet intrigued by the wealth and opportunity waiting in the South. Catherine, at 15, had been praised by her tutors as unusually gifted. Excelling in French and music skills, Thomas assured her would be useful in their new life. Only 8-year-old William seemed genuinely thrilled, young enough to see adventure where the rest of the family saw loss. What followed over the next 11 months would become one of the most disturbing cases of domestic ruin in New Orleans history, not born of superstition or curses, but of human decisions and human cruelty. The Caldwell home itself added to the strangeness of the story. Built with a rare partial basement in a city where the water table made such designs nearly impossible, The foundation included elaborate drainage systems, noted in records from 1798. Why the original owner, Jacques Beaumont, went to such lengths is unclear though. A letter he wrote to his architect unearthed in 1952 hinted at special accommodations below ground without explaining further. The house sat on 2 shadowed acres, its oaks hung heavy with Spanish moss that kept the property in gloom even at midday. A tall brick wall surrounded the land, unusually private for the time, and the house itself was built with far fewer windows than most, especially along the garden side where the well stood. The Caldwell arrival did not go unnoticed. On March 12, 1832, the Louisiana Courier reported that Boston merchant Thomas Caldwell and his family had taken up residence in the old Beaumont estate, noting his warm reception by the city's merchant association. 2 weeks later, the paper mentioned Eleanor at a ladies' tea described as polite and reserved, but pale and weary from the long journey south. For a brief time, life at the Caldwell estate seemed ordinary. Thomas set up his offices near the port. Eleanor began the delicate work of entering New Orleans society, and plans were made for the children's education. Beneath this surface of respectability, however, lay tensions and secrets that would soon unravel. James was placed under his father's guidance, apprenticing in the family business while keeping up his education with a private tutor. Catherine began lessons with Madame Devore, a highly regarded French instructor, who praised her sharp intellect, but noted in her records that the girl was occasionally distracted as if her attention drifted elsewhere. William, the youngest, enrolled at the Episcopal Parish School under Reverend Stillman, where he quickly stood out as bright and full of energy. For a time, all seemed to progress smoothly. Then in late April, just 6 weeks after the family's arrival, the first signs of trouble appeared. William suddenly refused to sleep in his upstairs bedroom. When asked why, he would only say that he heard scratching at night, like rats inside the walls. Eleanor brushed it off as childish nonsense, while Thomas ordered Elijah to inspect the room. Elijah reported no sign of vermin, but remarked that the walls felt unusually damp, though the city had seen no rain for nearly 2 weeks. The boy's fear did not pass. Within days, William abandoned his bed altogether, preferring to sleep on a settee in the drawing room despite repeated scoldings. Martha recalled in her testimony that the child looked increasingly exhausted with dark circles beneath his eyes. He picked at his meals, staring off as though he were listening to something no one else could hear. On the night of May 3rd, William suffered his first terror. Martha's meticulous journal, recovered after the events of 1833, described the moment the whole house woke to his screams. When I reached him, he stood by the window pointing to the garden, repeating, "They're coming up. They're coming up." Thomas, angry at the disruption, punished his son by sending him to bed without breakfast. By mid-May, the unease had spread through the entire household. Thomas, once a steady and disciplined businessman, began neglecting his affairs. His partner, Frederick Lawndale, wrote on May 17th that Caldwell had abruptly abandoned meetings twice that week, citing emergencies at home. "I wonder if he regrets his move south," Lawndale mused. Eleanor, who had seemed eager to take her place in society, now declined invitations she had once sought out. The diary of Constance Wellington, wife of a prominent banker, noted that Mrs. Caldwell turned down 3 social calls in as many weeks. "She appeared in good health. When I saw her at the market," Constance wrote, "so one must suspect another cause for her withdrawal." James and Catherine also grew more isolated. James's presence at the counting house became sporadic, with his father making excuses for him. Catherine abandoned her studies with Madame Devore by the end of May. The instructor's letter to Eleanor expressed alarm. "Your daughter shows signs of nervous exhaustion that exceed ordinary sensibilities. I advise medical consultation and fresh air." Even meals at the Caldwell home changed. Marie, the family cook, later told investigators that where once the family spoke freely at the table by May, their dinners had grown heavy with silence. They'd look at each other, she said, but no one spoke a word, as if every one of them carried a secret. Martha later testified that Eleanor would sometimes burst into tears without warning, as if weighed down by something unseen. Even more telling was Elijah's account. He said Thomas began asking questions about the property's past, pressing him to seek out old-timers in the quarter who might recall stories about the house. He was especially fixated on the well in the back garden, wanting to know whether it had always been there or if Jacques Beaumont had it dug himself. That well was unusual for New Orleans, where most households relied on cisterns to collect rainwater rather than digging into the unstable, flood-prone ground. When it was surveyed in 1963, during Professor Whitman's abandoned investigation, it measured over 30 feet deep, far deeper than any practical well in the city, and far deeper than needed to reach water. Why such a shaft was dug, no one has ever been able to explain. The first truly alarming incident came on June 7th, when Isabel discovered Catherine in a near catatonic state in the garden behind the house. She was kneeling beside the boarded-over well, her dress streaked with dirt as though she had been there for some time. Isabel said the girl did not respond for several minutes, her eyes locked on the dark wood beneath her hands. When she finally spoke, Catherine claimed she had heard someone calling her name from inside the well. Isabel later told the magistrate her eyes weren't right. They were open too wide, like she was looking at something terrible. And when she spoke, her voice sounded strange, deeper than it should have been. She said, "They know my name, Isabel. How do they know my name?" Frightened Isabel guided her back inside, where Thomas immediately summoned Dr. Marcus Beauford, a respected physician who treated many prominent families in the city. Thomas instructed Isabel not to breathe a word of the incident to anyone, a command that would become more common as the months went on. Beauford's official records, preserved in the Louisiana Medical Society archives, list his diagnosis as nervous exhaustion. He prescribed bed rest and a laudanum tonic, a standard remedy for anxiety at the time. But his private notes uncovered in 1952 reveal deeper misgivings. The Caldwell girl presents symptoms much like those I observed in the Raymond child in 27. The same vacant stare, the same obsession with sounds others cannot hear. I fear something within that house disturbs the mind. The Raymond case he referenced was chillingly similar. Elizabeth Raymond, a 12-year-old whose family briefly owned the property before the Caldwells, suffered a nervous collapse and was sent to an asylum. Records show she raved about voices rising from below and attempted to dig through the floorboards of her room with her bare hands. She died 6 months later from an infection caused by her self-inflicted wounds. In the days after Catherine's episode, Thomas acted quickly. On June 9th, he hired stonemasons to seal the garden well permanently. City records confirmed the work, noting that the well had already been covered with wooden boards that showed signs of having been disturbed not long before. The heavy concrete slab laid that day still covered the well for more than a century afterward. One of the stonemasons, Pierre Lafille, left a curious note in the margin of the invoice: water level unusually low for depth. No odor of a well. Smells instead like old meat. It was a small detail, but one that lingered. Through the long summer, the Caldwell household unraveled further. Martha later testified that the family no longer gathered together. Meals were taken separately, and even when they did share a table, little was said. It was like they were afraid of one another, she recalled. Thomas spent hours locked in his study, refusing interruptions. Eleanor sat for long stretches in the parlor, her eyes fixed on nothing. The children no longer played. James, once restless with ambition, became consumed by solitary trips to the basement. Eleanor tried to forbid him, which led to bitter arguments. In one heated exchange, James shouted, "Someone has to know what's down there," before storming out of the house. He returned hours later, covered in mud, refusing to explain where he had been. A journal later discovered in 1963, hidden in a hollow beneath his bedroom floor, revealed just how obsessed he had become. In late July, he wrote of meeting an old fish seller named Claude, who repeated stories his grandfather had told about the land. Long before Beaumont owned it, the French had called the area La Bouche de la Terre, the mouth of the earth. Claude would not say why. By September, the servants began hearing noises in the night. No longer the scratching William had once described, but a heavy rhythmic thumping from beneath the floors. Elijah, ever the practical man, searched the basement several times but found no explanation. "I ain't one to scare easy," he later admitted. But that basement was wrong. Always colder than the rest of the house, even in August heat. And sometimes I'd swear something shifted just beyond the corner of my sight. Around the same time, Marie the cook reported seeing Eleanor standing motionless in the garden, staring at the sealed well for nearly an hour. When she finally approached her, Eleanor seemed dazed and insisted she had only stepped outside a moment earlier. Yet her shoes were soaked with dew, and her dress hem was caked with dirt, as if she had been standing there since dawn. On September 23rd, Thomas Caldwell visited the Orleans parish clerk's office. Records show he demanded immediate access to property deeds and construction files relating to the house, the basement, and the well. The clerk noted in the margin that Caldwell appeared agitated, insisting he needed to know the original purpose of the basement. What he found in those documents is uncertain. Most of the records have been lost. But a letter discovered among his personal effects after February 1833 suggests he uncovered something so unsettling it weighed on him until the end. Among Thomas Caldwell's belongings, investigators later found an unsent letter addressed to a former business associate in Boston. It read in part, "I fear we have made a terrible mistake in coming here. There are household matters I cannot bring myself to write down. Eleanor believes we should leave at once. But how can we? Who would take this house if they knew what we now know? And I fear it may already be too late, that the place itself has altered us." The letter went on to make a cryptic reference to the property's original owner. Beaumont was no mere merchant. His ventures in the Caribbean went far beyond sugar and cotton. The basement chambers were built for a specific purpose, one that continues even now, without human hands. The well is only an entrance to something far older, far larger than I could have imagined. October brought the first visible sign of how far the family's decline had gone. Dr. Beaufort was called again, this time for Eleanor. She had developed raw abrasions across her hands and arms. Wounds the physician believed were self-inflicted from scrubbing her skin with a stiff brush. When asked why, she answered only, "I can feel them crawling under my skin. They come from below." Beaufort prescribed heavier doses of laudanum and urged the family to keep her under watch. In his private notes, however, he wrote, "Mrs. Caldwell's symptoms suggest delusional parasitosis. Yet her clarity of speech and steady gaze are not typical of madness. It may be that an environmental factor is at work, contaminated water perhaps, or mold within the old structure." More troubling still was the change in young William. Once a bright and playful child, he grew unnervingly quiet and spent hours drawing the same image again and again, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward, which he called the mouth. When asked what it meant, he would say only, "It's where they wait in the dark." By mid-October, Reverend Stillman removed him from the parish school. In a letter to Thomas, he explained, "The boy has become preoccupied with death and burial. He told his classmates that anyone who digs deep enough will find what has always been waiting." When pressed on this, he would not respond for the rest of the day. By November, Thomas himself had all but abandoned his business. His partners managed what remained while he spent long hours in the basement carrying down tools and emerging hours later, empty-handed, exhausted, and withdrawn. Eleanor seldom left her room, her decline nearly complete. On November 12th, Thomas purchased an unusual set of supplies from Duval's Hardware: a miner's lamp, 100 feet of rope, a pickaxe, and several heavy canvas sacks. The clerk noted that Caldwell asked for the delivery to be made quietly after dark. At the same time, James and Catherine turned their attention fully to the property's past. Receipts show James buying volumes on New Orleans' earliest colonial years, while Catherine began visiting St. Louis Cathedral, poring over parish records as if searching for some trace of an answer hidden in the city's earliest days. The visitor log at St. Louis Cathedral shows that Catherine specifically requested information about the French merchant who first built their home. On November 25th, she returned from the cathedral in a state of visible agitation and demanded an immediate family meeting from which the servants were barred. Martha later wrote that night was filled with raised voices and weeping behind the closed door of the study. By morning, none of the Caldwells appeared for breakfast. When Martha went to check on them, she found all four asleep in the parlor, still in their clothes, huddled around the fireplace as if they had kept watch through the night. A week later, on December 3rd, the household erupted into open violence. Both Martha and Isabel reported that Thomas and James clashed in the study. Shouting escalated into the sound of breaking objects before Elijah forced his way in. James stood with blood streaming from a cut on his forehead, while Thomas slumped in a chair staring blankly at the floor. Neither spoke of the fight again, and Thomas warned the servants never to mention it. A torn page from James's journal, later found, tucked into a book in the study, offered a chilling clue. Father refuses to see it. He believes sealing the access points will be enough that we can pretend it isn't there. But we've read the truth. We know what Beaumont was doing. We know about the sacrifices. The thing below has been fed too long to go back to sleep. That December brought a sharp turn in the weather, colder than any winter the city had seen in years. Frost clung to the ground some mornings, and the servants swore the Caldwell basement was colder still, so cold it felt unnatural. Marie refused to enter after describing a chill that pressed on my neck like hands. The harbor master's meteorological log from December 14th notes, "Peculiar cold spot observed near the old Beaumont house. Temperature 10 degrees lower than surrounding areas. No natural cause apparent." Christmas came and went in silence. No visitors, no candles or greenery, no celebration of any kind. Thomas ordered Martha to turn away callers, insisting the family was indisposed. Eleanor had not left her bedroom for nearly 2 weeks. When meals were brought up, she sat in a chair facing the corner, murmuring what sounded like a list of names under her breath. Most disturbing of all was William. The once cheerful boy began to walk in his sleep. For 3 nights in a row, Elijah found him barefoot in the frozen garden, standing motionless before the sealed well. Each time he led the child back indoors, William muttered the same phrase without waking. "They're hungry again." And yet, as the year turned, something in the Caldwell household seemed, at least on the surface, to shift. The first days of 1833 brought what appeared to be a sudden and surprising improvement. On January 4th, Thomas emerged from his study after 3 days behind locked doors and stunned the household with an announcement the family would return to Boston as soon as arrangements could be made. He seemed calmer than he had in months, even telling Martha, "We've been mistaken about many things. It's time to leave this behind." The change was abrupt, almost unnatural, yet undeniable. Thomas carried himself as though a great burden had been lifted, resuming his business with an air of normalcy. Eleanor too began leaving her room again, though she moved slowly, speaking little, like a woman caught in a dream. Even the children seemed quieter, less agitated, as trunks were packed and preparations began. A ship was secured for February 15th, and Thomas wrote to his banker in Boston on January 10th, confirming the family's return. In that letter, he included a cryptic note: "We leave behind certain investments that cannot be liquidated. I have made arrangements to ensure they remain undisturbed. Please place the enclosed document in your most secure vault, not to be opened unless absolutely necessary." No such document was ever found. The fragile peace shattered on January 21st. Catherine, last seen by Isabel reading near the sealed well in the garden, vanished without a trace. She never appeared for supper. When a search of the grounds revealed nothing, Thomas dismissed it, claiming she must have gone to visit a friend and would return shortly. But Isabel later testified that Catherine had been reading a strange little book that afternoon, bound in dark leather with no title. When asked about it, Catherine told her, "It's a story about hunger, the oldest kind of hunger." That book was never recovered. Days passed without sign of her. Eleanor broke down, accusing Thomas of knowing where Catherine had gone, screaming that he had let them take her too. James locked himself in his room, refusing food or company. Only William seemed unshaken. He looked at Martha and whispered, "The mouth is hungry." On January 25th, Thomas finally notified the authorities. Lieutenant Charles Dupre of the New Orleans Police was assigned to the case. His official report described a household in a state of severe distress not commensurate with the situation, and noted that Thomas resisted any thorough search of the property, especially the basement. In his personal journal, however, discovered years later after his death, Dupree wrote with greater candor, "The Caldwell house feels wrong. The air is stale though windows are open, and every sound is muffled, as though the walls themselves drink it in. The servants are clearly terrified, but will not say of what. The younger boy watches me with eyes that belong on an older man. I cannot shake the feeling they all know exactly what became of the girl." The search turned up nothing. Neighbors had seen no unusual comings or goings, and none of Catherine's belongings were missing. It was as though she had simply been swallowed by the grounds themselves. Lieutenant Dupre grew increasingly uneasy with Thomas Caldwell's refusal to allow the sealed garden well to be examined. In his official report, he wrote, "Mr. Caldwell becomes visibly agitated when the well is mentioned. When I suggested breaking the seal, he grew nearly violent in his opposition." His claim that the well was condemned for contamination is reasonable, but his reaction suggests otherwise. As January slipped into February, the family seemed to unravel. Eleanor now refused to leave her bedroom at all. James spent long hours in the garden, standing motionless before the sealed well as though waiting for something. Thomas continued with plans for their departure, but with a strange lack of urgency, as if the deadline no longer mattered. Most troubling was William. According to Martha's testimony, he had begun speaking to someone he called the dweller below. She recorded one incident in her journal. William stood by the basement door for nearly half an hour, whispering. When I drew close enough to hear, he was saying, "Yes, I know they're leaving. No, I won't tell. Yes, I understand what must happen first." When he saw me, he smiled, and I felt a chill I cannot describe. Then came the night of February 10th, 1833, a night that remained shrouded in mystery due to missing records and contradictory accounts. What is certain is that around 11 o'clock, Elijah was jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass. Investigating, he found the basement door wide open, a lamp burning at the top of the stairs. When he descended, he discovered Thomas and James laboring against the far wall, digging into the masonry. They had already broken through, revealing a dark tunnel that sloped downward into the earth. Elijah later testified that the men did not seem themselves. Exhausted, covered in soil, they worked with a mechanical determination unresponsive to his questions. Worse, they were murmuring together in some kind of chant words Elijah thought might be French, but which he could not understand. Frightened Elijah retreated upstairs to wake Martha and decide what to do. As they whispered in the hall, Eleanor emerged from her bedroom for the first time in days. Without a word, she walked past them pale and silent and descended into the basement. Martha and Elijah followed close behind, but when they reached the bottom, the basement was empty. The lamp still burned. The hole in the wall yawned open. But Thomas, James, and Eleanor were gone. At that moment, Elijah made his choice. He seized William, wrapped the boy in a blanket, and carried him through the cold night to the home of Dr. Marcus Beaufort, half a mile away. The physician's journal recorded their arrival just past midnight. Elijah appeared at my door in great distress, carrying young Caldwell, who seemed drugged or in a trance. The boy's eyes were half closed, and he mumbled words I could not make out. Dr. Beaufort's journal entry for February 11th paints a scene almost too terrible to believe. He wrote that Elijah's story so disturbed him that he felt compelled to return to the Caldwell house that night, taking his medical bag and his pistol. What Elijah told him is not recorded in detail, but Beaufort's later notes hint that it went beyond simple excavation. If even half of what Elijah described is accurate, he wrote the Caldwell family uncovered something that defies rational explanation. His account of the tunnel walls, the unnatural cold, and the sounds from beyond suggest that whatever lies beneath predates not only the house, but perhaps European settlement itself. At 1 o'clock that morning, Beaufort, Elijah, and 2 neighbors he had roused reached the Caldwell residence. In the kitchen, they found Martha and Marie huddled together, white-faced, whispering of inhuman wails rising from under the floor. The group descended to the basement, where they discovered the passage now fully exposed, the jagged opening, gaping like a wound. Beaufort's entry continues. The passage descended at a steep angle into darkness. Against my better judgment, I led our party down, lamp in one hand, pistol in the other. The air grew fouler with each step, a noxious miasma that burned the nostrils and eyes. After perhaps 20 feet, the passage leveled into a cavern, roughly 30 feet across. Tool marks suggested it had once been natural, but enlarged by human hands. My lamp revealed walls covered in markings, unlike anything I have ever seen. Not hieroglyphs, not any indigenous symbols known to me, but something alien shifting at the edge of perception, as though the very lines moved when watched. In the center of this chamber, they found the Caldwell family, Thomas, Eleanor, James, and shockingly, Catherine, missing for over 2 weeks. All 4 knelt in a circle around an ancient stone shaft older than the house above its rim, carved with the same strange symbols. None of them responded to the intruders. They swayed slightly, murmuring in a tongue Beaufort could not recognize. Each held a small knife and was cutting their own palms, letting blood drip into the black opening below. I placed my hand on Thomas's shoulder, Beaufort wrote. He turned to me with eyes that showed no recognition. It must be fed, he said in a voice not his own. It has always been fed. Panic overtook Beaufort then. He fired his pistol into the air, hoping to break the trance. Instead, the effect was immediate and horrifying. The entire family screamed as one, not in fear but in rage, and turned on them, knives still in hand. The lamp fell and went out, plunging the chamber into darkness. I heard Elijah cry out. Then one of the neighbors, Beaufort, wrote. Hands clutched at me from all sides as I fought blindly to reach the passage. How I escaped, I cannot say. Dr. Beaufort wrote. I remember only the incline beneath my feet and the sounds that followed me, sounds no human throat could make. His account ends there. City records, however, tell the rest. Beaufort staggered from the Caldwell house alone, bleeding from multiple stab wounds, and collapsed at the home of Police Captain Gerard Lamont. a police detachment rushed to the scene within the hour. Captain Lamont's official report describes a house silent and deserted. Martha Marie Elijah and the neighbors who had followed Beaufort were gone. Whether fled or dead, no one could say. The basement showed fresh disturbance, but no passageway was found. The wall Beaufort described appeared solid, as though it had never been breached. The captain admitted as much in his notes. Despite repeated inspections, no entrance to a tunnel or chamber could be located. Yet the floor bore clear signs of recent excavation and hurried refilling. The structure was unstable, preventing further digging. Most troubling was the state of the garden well. The concrete slab that had sealed it hundreds of pounds in weight had somehow been pried away. The opening was resecured, but officers noted the stench rising from its depths, a foul, unmistakable odor of decay. In a private letter to the mayor, later discovered among the city's archives, Lamont revealed what he did not include in the official record. The markings in the basement defy rational description, he wrote. And the well, God help me, the well is deeper than the water table allows. We found a trail of blood leading from the basement to its mouth, though no bodies were recovered. I strongly recommend the house be condemned and the ground left untouched. No trace of the Caldwell family was ever found. The investigation lingered for months before it was formally closed as unsolved. The house stood empty nearly a decade before being purchased and divided as the Garden District expanded. Advertisements for the remodeled property made one detail clear: the old well had been filled. In 1842, records show more than 20 tons of concrete were poured into the site, forming the foundation of a pavilion that still stands. The fate of young William Caldwell is perhaps the most disturbing epilogue. Left in the care of Beaufort's housekeeper that night, the boy never spoke again. In 1840, after repeated acts of self-harm, he was committed to the Louisiana State Asylum. There he spent his days clawing at the floor of his cell until his fingers bled. Dr. Malcolm Pierce, the attending physician, kept detailed notes calling William's condition the most disturbing case of mania I have witnessed in 30 years. The boy scratched the same circular design endlessly on walls, floors, and when denied paper, even his own flesh a circle with jagged lines radiating outward, the same image he once called the mouth. The pattern William drew never varied, a perfect circle, thin lines radiating outward like a sun, but always with a dark center that he shaded in using whatever he could find, sometimes even his own blood. More unsettling were his rare moments of animation. Though silent for most of his life, asylum records note that he would sometimes press his ear to the floor and listen intently, nodding as if hearing a voice only he could detect. In those moments, his expression shifted into something that Dr. Pierce described as an understanding too dreadful to name, not fear but recognition. William Caldwell died in 1848 at the age of 24. On his deathbed, after 15 years of silence, he whispered a final phrase: "The mouth is still hungry." His autopsy revealed a strange anatomical anomaly, deformed inner ears that would have made him acutely sensitive to sounds far below the range of normal human hearing. As for Martha Marie and the others present in the house on that night in February 1833, no trace of them was ever found. No death certificates, no census entries, no burial records. It was as though they had been erased from the city's memory, their names surviving only in a handful of legal notes. Dr. Marcus Beaufort lived on, but never truly recovered. His medical practice faltered as he became consumed with an obsession for the structures beneath New Orleans. He filled journals with sketches of caverns, tunnels, and impossible chambers, referring to them only as the architecture beneath. In 1841, he published a paper titled "On Certain Anomalous Geological Formations." Beneath the city of New Orleans, dismissed immediately by his peers as the ravings of a disordered mind. The work was forgotten until rediscovered more than a century later by Professor Whitman in 1963. In its pages, Beaufort argued that the ground beneath parts of the city was not solid bedrock, but riddled with an artificial network of passages older than any known human settlement. Most alarming, he claimed these structures were designed not for habitation, but for containment. Beaufort died in 1845, officially, of a cerebral hemorrhage. But rumors spread that he had ended his own life following a final solitary expedition into the tunnels beneath the city. His last journal entry, written 3 days before his death, contained only 5 words: "I have seen it again." It remembers me. The Caldwell property itself passed into new hands as the Garden District grew. The original house was divided into 3 residences, while the garden where the well once stood was paved over and turned into a shared green space around a pavilion built on 20 tons of poured concrete. Today, it is one of the most desirable addresses in New Orleans, and few who walk the shaded grounds know that beneath the manicured lawns lies the buried mouth of the earth and the story of a family that disappeared into it. For decades, the Caldwell tragedy slipped into obscurity, remembered only in scattered legal files and the dust of private collections. But the story refused to stay buried. In 1908, renovations on one of the properties that once formed part of the Caldwell estate brought the past violently back to the surface. Workers broke into a hidden sub-basement and uncovered several sets of human remains. The coroner estimated the bones to be between 75 and 100 years old, but their identities and causes of death could not be determined. The most disturbing detail was the arrangement. The skeletons were laid out in a circle around a stone structure resembling a well. Each skull faced inward toward that ancient centerpiece. The Orleans Parish Coroner's report noted that the bones bore no obvious signs of violence, yet their deliberate placement suggested ritual rather than accident. Each skeleton was accompanied by a small blade of French manufacture dating from the late 18th century, as though each person had arrived prepared for the gathering. The case was briefly reopened, but with no living witnesses and little usable evidence, it was closed once again. The remains were quietly interred at Lafayette Cemetery, and the chamber filled with concrete before construction resumed. The property owner, Edward Hathaway, insisted that no word of the discovery reach the newspapers, fearing damage to property values in the developing Garden District. Yet in private letters later donated to the Historical Society by his granddaughter Hathaway, revealed his true unease. The arrangement of those poor souls suggests not murder, but some manner of rite, he confessed. The expressions frozen on their faces haunt me still. It was not agony, but rapture. What compelled them to kneel thus, and what did the central structure demand of them? I ordered the chamber sealed not only for propriety, but because I fear something was disturbed by our intrusion. The unease surfaced again in 1924 when a Tulane graduate student named Marion Lefebvre conducted research into unusual architectural features of Garden District basements for her thesis. Unaware of the Caldwell estate's history, she noted a consistent anomaly. Homes built on the former property were measurably colder than others in the neighborhood. Using thermometers placed throughout the basements, Lefebvre documented temperature differences of up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The coldest readings were always concentrated around the same location, the ground beneath the garden pavilion, the very site where the Caldwell well had once stood. Some of the old pipes, the maintenance supervisor recalled, were made of a stone he couldn't identify, carved with markings unlike any architectural style he had ever encountered. In 1963, Professor Harold Whitman of Tulane University began studying the Caldwell case as part of a broader survey of historic crimes in New Orleans. With permission from the property's owners, he carried out limited excavations around the site of the old garden pavilion. At first, Whitman's notes were steady and academic, focused on archives maps and architectural surveys. But over time, the tone of his work began to shift. By his third month on the project, his research had taken a darker turn. In an entry dated July 17, 1963, Whitman wrote, "The core samples from beneath the pavilion contain organic material unlike anything I anticipated. Dr. Reinhardt in biology suggests it may be fungal, yet it matches no known species. More troubling samples taken over 3 days show clear movement within the matter, always toward the exact center point of the original well." After that, his journals reveal a growing obsession with circles. He linked William Caldwell's childhood drawings, the pattern of the bones discovered in 1908, and the radial spread of the cold spots documented by Lefebvre in 1924. These were not coincidences, he argued, but signs of what he called the structure beneath. He became convinced that the pattern was not symbolic, but functional, tied to something vast and deliberate beneath the ground. His final entry, dated August 24, 1963, was short and unsettling. "I have found references in Beaumont's private papers to Le Puissance Fond, the bottomless well. It is no metaphor. It is a name, and it has been known far longer than we have dared admit.